All right, we are live for another live reading from my book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Christian Philosophy Debates in France. And we are smack dab in the middle of one of the big pieces from the middle of the work, Maurice Blondel's The Problem of Catholic Philosophy, which was a presentation at the meeting of the Société de Philosophie in 1932 and was published in Les Études Philosophiques, the journal associated with it, in 1933. And one of the interesting things about this were there were letters. Blondel was in physically not great condition. He was nearly blind at this time and had to work by correspondence, and he had a secretary who would read things aloud to him and then take dictation. So what we actually have here are four letters about Blondel's presentation, which he had written out ahead of time. So these are people responding to what Blondel had to say. We have Enrico Castelli, Jean Delvolve, and then we have Henri Gouillet, who's a little bit better known. And then finally, the only figure of these who's probably still well known today, Joseph Maréchal. And I think there's over 20 pages of these letters and responses. So I think I'm just going to do the first two today, in part because I'm a little worn down. It's the end of the semester. I just finished earlier this morning giving a 2-hour presentation about Epictetus. So I'm going to, cut it shorter a little bit today. So I'll just read the letters by Castelli and Delvolve and then Blondel's responses to them, about 10 pages worth of text. So here is the comments of Mr. Enrico Castelli. Regarding the new proceedings on the problem of Catholic philosophy that Maurice Blondel presented at the session of last November 26th, I send you the following reflections. They are not an explicit response to the questions Mr. Blondel raised, but rather to the problems formulated by Mr. Etienne Gilson. I nevertheless believe they might help add a note to this interesting controversy. In his inquiry about Christian philosophy's notion, Mr. Gilson, noting that the expression Christian philosophy is used frequently enough in our day, raised the problem of such a notion's possibility, observing right at the start that certain theologians of the Middle Ages exclude the possibility of such a notion. From their point of view, revelation renders philosophical research useless by resolving once and for all the problem raised by critique. It is this attitude Mr. Blondel summarizes in this way in order to attack it. Let us cultivate our garden without letting ourselves be guided by imagination or by pride. Let us leave behind these transcendent speculations, ages of decadence take pleasure in, and which are a negation of good sense. But one objection, an uneliminable and decisive one, arises. Revelation must be understood. In the second place, revelation not being total demands this critical deepening, which can even sometimes seem the negation of common sense. Already Pascal had written, we must judge of doctrine by miracles, we must judge of miracles by doctrine. Certainly rationalism's objection raised by the same Gilson is more serious. There can be Christians who would be philosophers, but no Christian philosophers. It is in this way that a Christian philosophy's possibility is excluded, because philosophy dispenses with revelation as reason dispenses with prejudice. For Neo-Thomism as well, the notion has no meaning. Quote, it is only due to its rationality that Thomism should be a philosophy and a true philosophy. The result is that if the Thomist philosophy, it is insofar as rational, not insofar as Christian. To the contrary, in Augustinianism, the expression seems fully justified. Perhaps, Gilson observes, because Augustine's philosophy implies man in his concrete state, that is, by including his religious life in that state. But the thing that interests us the most is not knowing if Augustinianism justifies more or less such a notion, a purely historical problem, but rather understanding its possibility. Historical problems interest us only in a limited way, and the fact that a H. Ritter or A. Stuckel wrote a history of Christian philosophy does not demonstrate such a philosophy's possibility. There is a revelation of which the church is the guardian. Revealed doctrine cannot contradict reason, for in that case, we would not in any way be able to take account of the supernatural character of that doctrine. In fact, one can recognize that character only by resting it on sufficient reasons. If the reasons that are brought were not sufficient, that is good, we would not have good reasons to believe that doctrine to be revealed. That is, if revelation transcended our intellect, it would remain unknown. It is impossible, in my opinion, to be able to hold ourselves back from this alternative, which does not, however, keep faith's beginning from presupposing grace. Quote, if anyone says that the assent to Christian faith is not free, but necessarily produced by arguments of human reason, let him be anathema. This is from the De Fide of the First Vatican Council. The theologians' repeated exertions are rightly oriented in this sense. Mystery is above reason and not contrary to reason. Still, we cannot fail to note that there are problems that seem to justify only the contrary thesis. For example, the irrationality of mystery in the order of divine foreknowledge, because of the contradiction that exists between foreknowledge and spontaneity. Hence the oportet in philosophia haereticem esse of Pomponazzi. How to resolve this conflict? A conflict that, taking account of Canon 2 of De Fide, is doubly complicated because of the antinomy of liberty and necessity. For, quote, either you see with certainty that God has spoken, or you do not see it with certainty, writes Pierre Rousselot in an article that would merit being better known. In the first case, how can the assent be free? In the second, how can it be legitimately certain? The dilemma's simplicity should not cause its force to be unrecognized. Many actually uphold the necessity of a blind belief preceding clear knowledge. Others, to the contrary, advise first examining and deepening, and then believing afterwards. It is too evident that while the former compromise certainty, the latter compromise freedom. Voluntarism or intellectualism? This is not a case of closing one's eyes. There is a difficulty here, and a serious one. The motives we have for believing either are or are not sufficient. If they are sufficient, they become true and proper reasons. If they are not, I repeat, we do not have sufficient reasons to believe that the doctrine that is proposed to us is revealed. Can a solution to this difficulty be found? Let us reflect. A rigorous and earnest reasoning could not be conclusive. For a reasoning, rigor is one thing, conclusiveness is another, and it could not be conclusive by consequence of some possible errors that are used as its base. Can we rule out a more deepened study of premises? Certainly not. Still, if this is always possible, is this always easy? I do not believe it is. The infinite number of common senses, logical assumptions, fetters the work and at times prevents coming to a solution of the greatest problems. On the other hand, if the restlessness ceaselessly pushing us to the search for truth is the indispensable condition for the understanding of that truth, all too often, alas, it transforms this aid into an obstacle. Abstract logics, extratemporal laws possess value as means, only as means allowing the immediate datum to be surpassed. But if the fact of being necessary means for resolving the vital problem of destiny is precisely what gives the laws their value, it is also true that logical thought cannot exist outside of the psychic fact, at least accepting Plato's doctrine. That is, outside of the initiatives where that necessary element which makes of a succession of psychic facts a fully and consciously lived life and not a simple and chaotic succession of experiences has not yet been distinctly enough recognized. Conscious life presents us the dramatic alternative of a decisive choice: to be or not to be, To be. That is to enlarge and augment always our consciousness of being, not to be. That is to diminish ourselves, to believe wrongly that one can dilly dally the whole length of the road, force oneself to separate life from that effort that sets its ideal above and beyond the present, but for whose realization the present alone is decisive because it decides the person's future. Anguishedly searching to understand themselves, people often wind up in a complete lack of understanding. A bitter conclusion, doubtless, but one that finds its reason in these assumptions of common sense our weak strengths do not end up eliminating. We can believe to have accomplished the deepening and to believe it in good faith, but from that point on, when the conflict between reason and faith presents itself, and it is always present, it always presents itself sooner or later, even when we least expect it. Is this conflict not the best justification of those who doubt the deepening? It is not that doubt excludes deepening, it excludes only its sufficiency. One can say in opposition, if it is systematic doubt of the preceding deepening that engenders this exclusion, this would justify the skepticism of those whose belief stems from cowardice. To them we respond. If people, slaves of their passions and desiring to flee them, embrace a faith because in it they see their liberation, the faith that they embrace is not deliverance, but only the desire for deliverance. This vain faith gives an illusion of life to things that are dead, for many men lie to themselves and lie in order to give themselves courage. But hope is a virtue, and those who renounce it fall inevitably into skepticism. It is the actual life of truth that prays, and which obtains the view of charity, Malebranche wrote. Well, then, there are two types of faith, the faith of love and the faith of desire. He who loves gives, he who desires demands. And those who believe in dead things do not love them, they only desire them. This exclusion is the virtue of hope's reason for being, which blossoms in the souls of those who do not let themselves be brought down by life's difficulties, but who, despite all that, certain of the fertility of their efforts, beyond the sadness that sometimes weighs very heavily, make their faith a conquest by enlivening it and fighting for it. It is only in this sense that a Christian philosophy is not only possible, but necessary. So here's Mr. Blondel's response to Mr. Castelli. Mr. Castelli's reflections bear not on the problem that I set out, but, as he explicitly notes, on the way in which Mr. Gilson envisages the problem of Christian philosophy from a double point of view, historical and rationalist at the same time. I do not have to enter personally into that debate. The multiple difficulties that Mr. Castelli raises contribute more to showing the interest he has in envisaging the problem in a different way than others have done. They do not touch on the positions in relation to which I have located myself. The result even of Mr. Castelli's diversely convergent critiques is that if we seek a solution on the terrain of history and of concepts, we are led to mix two orders of questions in reality different from each other. On the one hand, we seek in the doctrines of the past the traces of the Christian contribution insofar as revealed teaching is philosophically assimilable in the form of rational concepts, so that the relation between Christian dogma and philosophical speculation is confined within the ensemble of a system of ideas composable with each other, making abstraction of all supernatural and humanly inaccessible character, specifically human data. On the other hand, as Mr. Castelli shows, a difficulty inevitably arises that we cannot fail to recognize or eliminate without making the very meaning of most essential Christian demands disappear. From the very viewpoint a philosophy of concepts sets itself within, reason and faith cannot coincide, and it is the role of reason in the act of faith, or the role of faith in the reasonable adherence to the revealed truths, that becomes incomprehensible. It must even be added that the historical notional way in which the problem has been envisioned brings in its wake an inextricable confusion between two problems extremely important to distinguish and resolve, each for its own sake, without failing in this to recognize the solidarity connecting them together. The first of these problems is that of the autonomy of a rational doctrine developing its legitimate certainties in an organism of truths of the natural or metaphysical order, and this without compromising the reality of the supernatural order and its demands, which neither repress nor wound reason, but complete it and satisfy it. The other problem is that of the reasonable character intrinsic to the adherence to faith without this compromising the role of freedom or the need for grace for the supernatural act of faith. We see well enough the deep distinction that exists between this use of reason in the heart of religious belief and that other use of rational speculation for the completeness and comprehensiveness of the knowledge it can acquire about objects falling under its competence. Nobody will be able to justify the existence of a Catholic philosophy except by extricating themselves from these confusions and putting themselves in a perspective very different from that toward the debate brought us, a debate from which I would like to free our readers. The service that Mr. Castelli renders us is to show us by his critiques and his desiderata that the road that many have gone down is an impasse. He leads us, therefore, to turning ourselves back to the sole road that leads somewhere. All right, so now we have the comments of Mr. Jean Delvolve. I do not wish to confine myself to repeating here under other forms the wish that I formulated in a letter addressed to Mr. Maurice Blondel and that he did me the great honor of reproducing at the end of his presentation summary. I believe I will better bear witness to the deep sympathy with the thought of a philosopher who has engaged all the strength of his soul in philosophy by not holding myself to the too easy position of an attempt at agreement yet to come, but by bringing out several remarks about the very basis of the problem, even if they must cause to arise the sentiment of a current divergence. I give my full agreement to the conclusions of Mr. Blondel's method. Yes, the question ought to be examined, and with neither prejudice nor reticence. My reason for this is first that I refuse to adhere to a mythical notion of reason, to regard that what we give this name as a fixedly determined and sufficient power that the human mind sets to work in order to know all that it belongs to it to know. I see there a varied and variable ensemble on the common theme of certain elementary useful means of rational procedures serving to illuminate experience, a term that is itself not susceptible of designating something other than an acquired state of illumination of being. Rational procedures develop themselves, coordinate themselves, renew themselves in time, obtain effects diversely inadequate, but of a generally growing value. I do not consider our human reason of today as radically distinct and different in its most elevated forms from simple sensible rationality. But to be sure, from another point in the levels of consciousness, it would appear to some mind as imperfect as sensible rationality appears to us. Complementary, I discard any mythical notion of fact understood as a fixed and determined element of any rational consciousness. This term is applied successively or confusedly to either sensible perceptions concretized around human functional interests, biological, psychological, or social, or to abstractions, spontaneously or reflectively constructed for the use of objectifying analysis or aesthetic representation, irreducible to the two preceding types or to states such as those of the mystic affirming to have experienced their immediate union with God. So that, to be definitive, fact cannot receive a general signification different from that which I attributed above to experience. These points established, denial of any intimate connection between philosophy and religious faith referred to revelation by alleging a pretended autonomy of philosophy, rationally drawing its knowledge from facts, seems to me to be vain and arbitrary. This cannot be presented as a constant philosophical demand, but as a pretension specific to a narrow and, dare I say, outmoded positivism. But on the other hand, I feel the need to discuss in parallel the signification of the term supernatural revelation, opposed to that of the term rational knowledge. The significations of these two terms are correlative. If I accepted understanding rational knowledge exclusively as knowledge of a nature whose representation was exhausted in a summary of necessary relations connecting the determined facts, the sort of nature assumed by positivism, supernatural would doubtless signify something foreign to that nature, thus rationally inconceivable, but susceptible nevertheless by some no less inconceivable operation of being displayed to the mind and becoming the object of an affirmation of existence. Supernatural revelation, understood in this sense, is radical miracle, evident and perfectly unintelligible at the same time. Is such a notion real or imaginary? Does it offer some interest to thought? In any case, it evaporates along with the notion of rationality to which it's opposed, and which is only a falsified interpretation of clarity of consciousness or of spiritual clarity. This clarity is illuminated from the heart of being, activates itself by different procedures of objectivization, deploys itself by the diffusion of the object of irradiating an action, and of the feeling of being, concentrates itself again in a reflection that aims at total being and tries to abolish the multiple points of the objective surface from which these rays are sent. For this region of clarity, which may be called, from the name of its means of generation, rational consciousness, what signification will the term of supernatural take? Doubtless not that of something foreign to the being that is that very clarity's principle and end. It will therefore be able in the interior of the luminous net to help form the analytic starting point between the objective spectacle, a provisional ensemble of abstractions to which it is permitted to restrict the term nature, and the ontological source and endpoint of the light of consciousness. How would the supernatural not indivisibly arise for philosophy and for religion? From what source, if not from the most interior of being, would there come supernatural revelation? And what philosophy, unmutilated in its heart, would be repulsed by naming God the living principle just as much as the final object of its speculative effort? From the historical point of view, I think I see clearly the constant continuity of religious forms and philosophical forms, whether it be in Mediterranean antiquity, where the religious forms and their most living manifestations appear as forms of intelligibility rationally exceeding the brutality of sensible constructions, and where the philosophical forms, that is, reflectively rational forms of all the ages, cannot hand over their full signification to those who claim to cut off their religious roots, or in the new Judeo-Christian religious impulsion correlative to the general dissolution of the Greco-Roman social forms. From the apologetic point of view, the notion of revelation is offered primitively under the main aspect of the sensible miracle breaking functional perception, but not of all sensible miracles, rather only of those that witness to the generative power of an intelligibly conceived order. And it is offered more progressively under the primary aspect of the manifest inspiration of men, of writings of churches. Manifest, that is, evident to the mind, whether by indubitable historical reconnection to the miracle or to the initial evidence, or whether it be by immediate recognition in written thought or in the speeches and acts of men or of the church, of the index of God who's been conceived. And it is offered as well under the simplified aspect of a mystical communication, whose authenticity ought to be discerned by a very subtle speculation that rejects the false testimony of analogous states and thus relates the true communication to the intelligible order on which prayer is grounded. All of these are aspects that forbid separating revelation from rational assessment. It remains to try to make precise the difference and the relation of religion and philosophy in the great genre of spiritual vision. For me to try that here in these lines of a letter would be rash. Instead, I might try to indicate, without providing any justification of it, the direction of my thought, and to satisfy what I believe to be a demand of sincerity by letting be seen how it seems to diverge from the perspectives that Mr. Maurice Blondel's work has powerfully illuminated for us. Mr. Blondel has made an audacious and magnificent effort to integrate all of the philosophical rationality and all of religion represented in the unique and perfect form of the Catholic religion, rational philosophy constituting a vast foundation that receives its indispensable crowning from the essential revelations of faith. It is this product of integration that he calls Catholic philosophy. I conceive of a more intimate fusion, or rather a certain radical unity. In religion, I see living human spirituality that is incarnated in the biosocial organism of the human species. It emanates from the depths of being and raises the life in man to the level of the threshold of rational consciousness, of which religious representation is a spontaneous production. How can one refuse to call its source divine and its development providential, carrying out for the benefit of successive sketches of rational vision and social materialization, but with the meaning of an inspiration, or if one prefers, of a constant aspiration of being through the generations? This providential movement has nothing uniform in its course, nor in the continuity of its contexture, taking place in the ponderous complexity of sensible and noetic matter. In the heart of this movement of the growing mind, rational effort, although subordinated to the aspiration that it illuminates, reveals its destiny and plays a major role. I see philosophy consisting in the cluster woven around reflectively rational effort, a cluster that differentiates itself by the providential movement's nudges to the heart, and that there takes on a growing, though always relative, autonomy, even when it comes to lose the sense of its functional solidarity. But its real autonomy is capable of growing to the degree only that rationally reflective thought progresses in the supernatural domain of being, so that it meshes in with the biological and social movement of humanity. For the liberation of the mind in relation to the body, rejected by the Christian representation in the eternity of a future life, cannot also be conceived by the most reflectively rational thought, except as limit and to infinity. As to the present time, it seems to me characterized by a state of contraction onto itself of the rational cluster, which pursues its own growth without thereby benefiting, or benefiting only a little, the living spirituality, whose most living and highest established form, doubtless not independent of some prejudice deriving from the spiritual race, I am inclined to see in the Catholic religion. The consequence is that our moment, already many times secular, is that of a certain functional disunion, painfully damaging to the realization of spiritual life. These hasty notes permit, I hope, to make a little more precise the meaning that the wish for communion Mr. Blondel was willing to recall takes in my mind. All right. Mr. Blondel's response to Mr. Delvolve. I must warmly thank Mr. Delvolve for having opened to our reflections in two different directions, deep perspectives that to be fully explored require more space than I have here. In a first direction, his penetrating genetic analyses set us on guard against an easy and frequent triple illusion. At the start, he denounces the superstitious use of the word in the concept of reason, then that of fact, finally that of revelation. In agreement with him for a long portion of his trajectory in the way I will soon indicate, I admit, however, not being able to stop there like him and draw a conclusion. It is very true that the cyclical idea of a reason stabilized in principles, in notions, in laws, ne varieter, is a myth, not one of those that are stimulating as a future and effective idea, even if a chimerical one, but as an extrapolative stabilization that, according to Maine de Biran's expression, risks killing the inquiry, becoming the death of analysis, and canonizing laziness. Still, it should be said that outside of the facts that we will have to critique, reason is pure anomy, that outside of the habits that set up positive data in it and by it, reason would have no strength, no light to go further ahead, to study the conditions implied in all conscious perception and in all reflective thought. Above all, should we say that reason analyzing itself cannot determine the springs that stimulate its exercise, the limits of its scope, the aims that are normatively its own, that it cannot dispense with and abstain from, even when it does attain them? On this first point, I believe more than Mr. Delvolve does in the intrinsic value and the original nature of human reason. In what concerns facts, we willingly recognize the difficulty of grasping what we willingly call positive or scientific data as if it were something concrete, for this is a matter of decoupled aspects of extracts or abstractions we raise to fragmentary entities or to links in an indefinitely extensible series. In a sense, it is an elaboration of thought that gives us the facts just as much as they are given and imposed on thought. But philosophy and science labor precisely to distinguish and reconnect these diplopic aspects. And through this double labor, our certainties are purified and confirmed by manifesting the profound realism of reason itself, which becomes conscious of its own function by leading us from rational forms all the way up to an intelligible and spiritual order. On this second point, again, my assessment is that the witness of facts, thanks to critical and metaphysical analysis, possesses a solidity and admits of a precision that does not leave philosophical speculation to chance in discernment of the realities most important to man. If Mr. Delvolve preserves the role of religious consciousness and divinizing aspirations, he still finds the idea of revelation to be equivocal and indefinable for the very reason that for him the variability of reason and facts leaves something indiscernible between moral or religious consciousness's drive and what would be a contribution from outside and from on high. In agreement with him in guarding myself from pretended revelations and false mysticisms, I believe, however, that the notion of a supernatural intrinsically such, historically proposed, and experimentally authentic is conceivable, verifiable, and assimilable. And as this is all that I have tried to establish, I can only leave it up to my readers to decide the case. The second perspective, by which Mr. Delvolve causes us to see with an accent of moving generosity in his conclusion, manifests the depth of the spiritual crisis and the religious aspiration in some of the most cultivated minds and some of the highest souls of our times. This is the debate's entire vital knot that would have to be undone and redone if I needed to explain why and how the religious drive, while arising from the very ground of nature and of man, has its point of beginning and contact, its constant spring, its progressive march in the supreme end and in the supernatural vocation, without which nothing of man's unique and obligatory destiny would be set in motion, orient itself, be illuminated, get anywhere. The flourishing of nature, yes, assuredly, but under the heat and the magnetization of a double gift, that of the spiritual nature that aims at possession and at perfect beatitude, and that of grace, accorded to all, which alone renders ascension possible up to the divine terminus. These degrees to be distinguished and to be carved out are not arbitrarily set out, nor seen simply from outside. I have tried to show that they are implied in the entire movement of our thought with the rigor of an internal dynamism that has nothing imprecise or merely supplemental to it. So that's the end of Blondel's response to Delvolve. So I want to say one thing before I address questions, comments, and stuff like that. And it's kind of a little bit of backstory about this. So this book almost didn't come about in a way because Catholic University of America Press, in their acquisitions process, after I'd done all these translations and stuff, wanted to pass on it. And wanted to pass on it because the person who they had hired to do the review of the translation focused in lazily only on Mr. Delvolve's portion of the work. And Delvolve, as you can tell by the English translation of it, is not an easy writer. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure how coherent his ideas truly are. And it was, it's sort of like taking a symphony composed of many different people's contributions and focusing in on the one bit that doesn't sound quite right, as if it's characteristic of the whole. And the reason why things actually this ended up getting published is I wrote back an angry email to the editor and said, your reviewer is clearly off base here, and if you don't, if this is the sort of crap that you're actually going to have for reviews, I'll just take this elsewhere and publish it somewhere else. And then the editor looked over the stuff and he's like, oh yeah, this reviewer actually was kind of lazy and focused in on the wrong things. Delvolve is somebody who I was never able to find much information about. And his writing is very convoluted. All right. So perspective philosophy says feels platonic. That doesn't mean anything. What feels platonic and what do you mean by platonic? There's the Platonism of Plato. There's the Platonism of Middle Platonism. There's the Platonism of Neoplatonism. There's the sort of slur word Platonic from Nietzscheans or Marxists or whoever else. So I don't know what that's actually supposed to mean or what it's supposed to refer to. We got to be specific in what we're saying. Ricky says that is how you write a peer review. Yeah, and that was something that you can say that one of the cool things about the debates is that these people read each other's stuff, took seriously what the other people had to say, reviewed things critically, made clear where they differed on things. I mean, that's not the only thing to recommend these debates and this particular translation of important documents, but that is kind of a cool thing that comes out of it. Some of them were a bit uncharitable to each other, particularly Blondel in relation to Gilson and Maritain and Gilson in relation to Blondel. But on the whole, it was philosophers like doing really solid work. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do the work of translating and publishing this. So, all right. Any other questions, comments spurred by this? If not, we'll have a short session today. Like I mentioned, I'm a little bit worn down. I had to present at 7 a.m. here for 2 hours online for the Brazilian Epictetus seminar that was going on. And I'm still in the process of finishing out the semester here. Looking forward to some downtime for a little while over the holiday break, although there's always lots of work to do. We'll resume these live readings after the new year, in part because looking at the calendar, what was the justification? So Thursday is the 23rd. Things are kind of winding down. And then the next Thursday is the 30th. Again, things are kind of winding down, getting ready for New Year's. And so we'll start again on the 6th of January with more readings from this. And we'll finish those other 2 letters, the one from Henri Gouillet, the one from Joseph Maréchal. And then we've got a really interesting discussion going on between Maurice Blondel, Jacques Paillard, and Gaston Berger. So, all right. Well, if there aren't any other questions or comments, I'm going to bid all of you a good rest of the day wherever you happen to be, and I will see you next time.